Hello and welcome to Building a Roadmap for Success, an effective clinical model for managing complex functional medicine cases. My name is Adair Anderson. I'm the product marketing educator here at Vibrant and want to go over some quick housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but if you have questions during the presentation, please submit them as a comment. There will be time at the end for Q&A. Also, this webinar is being recorded and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the webinar ends. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy. Dr. Noseworthy is a seasoned expert in chiropractic neurology and functional medicine with over 2 decades of experience. He obtained his doctorate from Logan College of Chiropractic in 1995 and became a board-certified chiropractic neurologist in 1997. Dr. Noseworthy initially directed a multidisciplinary clinic in South Florida, working with various healthcare professionals across chiropractic, naturopathic, and allopathic fields. In 2007, he transitioned to solo 100% virtual practice, merging brain-based spinal rehabilitation with functional medicine. By 2008, he shifted his clinical focus exclusively to functional medicine, becoming a prominent speaker for Apex Energetics. His Apex seminars covered diverse topics such as mastering functional blood chemistry, mastering the thyroid, and mastering brain chemistry, all of which are designed to make complex medical concepts accessible to practitioners across the United States. Dr. Noseworthy also developed the postdoctoral course Neurology and Nutrition for the Maryland University of Integrative Health's Master Degree in Clinical Nutrition program and continues to coach healthcare providers internationally through his unique autonomous health approach. This method emphasizes personalized care strategies that empower patients to achieve long-term health improvements by addressing metabolic, immune, and neurological challenges. Take it away, Dr. N.
Thank you, Adair, for that introduction. So what's the hardest part of any presentation is sitting silently while somebody else reads about your background. So welcome everybody. Since we only have about 45 minutes, I'm not going to do a ton of introduction, but if you will indulge me just for a moment, I want to engage in some shameless self-promotion and tell you about the 2 podcasts that I run. It'll be my honor if you would listen to those, particularly subscribe. But the first podcast that I started a couple of years ago was, or is designed for the general public, and that's listed under the name Inflammation Nation. And you can find both of these podcasts on Apple, Spotify, pretty much anywhere that podcasts are listed. And while the Inflammation Nation is geared to the layperson, I do talk a lot of functional medicine. And I do have a lot of practitioners that follow me there. But what you might be more interested in is the other podcast that I run called Funk Med Nation. And my intent with Funk Med Nation, with that podcast, is to have conversations with successful clinicians, researchers, lab companies, pretty much anybody who has some kind of impact or insight into what you and I do as clinicians. And my first interview on the Funk Med Nation was with Datis Karazian. Some of you guys might recognize his name. And I would say that aside from Jeffrey Bland, who was the father of functional medicine, actually coined the phrase, I don't think anybody has had as much impact on our industry as Dr. Karazian has had. And since he's the guy that I've been teaching for 16 years or so, it seemed fitting for me to launch the podcast with him. The second episode was with this other guy that you see up there, Tim Kaki. You probably don't recognize him by sight, but you'll know him as one of the co-founders of the nutraceutical giant Metagenics. And in the last year or so, I've had conversations with many different amazing clinicians and researchers. And here's just a short list. There's actually more if you go to the podcast and look at the episode list. But let me just run through this very quickly, just so you can see the kind of conversations that we're having out there. Dr. Chris Turnbaugh runs arguably the largest functional medicine clinic in the US. Dr. Sam Yannick is the founder of Cogence Immunology, and I've fondly dubbed him the father of functional immunology. Then I've had conversations with Satya Patel, James Maskell of Evolution Medicine. One of my favorite episodes was with Marty Gabala, who's a researcher out of Canada, and he's one of the top researchers in high intensity interval training. Then there's Nathan Bryan, one of the top leading researchers in nitric oxide and the creator of several nitric oxide support formulas. And most recently, I'm in the middle of a multi-episode interview with 2 neurodevelopmental experts, and that's doctors Robert Melillo and Peter Schreier. And in the first episode, we talk about Rob's best-selling book called Disconnected Kids and the incredible work that they're doing in helping people overcome autism, attention deficit, hyperactivity, OCD, and many more. And again, there's more lists or more episodes that you can listen to. So please, if you will, again, shameless promotion, go ahead and look at Apple or Spotify and look for the Funk Foundation. It would be my honor to have you as a listener. All right. So let me start by saying for the record that the smarter I get, the dumber I feel. And honestly, the more that I study human function and the more I realize how truly magnificent it is, the more that I realize that you don't know what you don't know. And to throw out another cliche, the more you know, the more that you know that you don't know. And that can either be discouraging or it can be inspiring. It can be discouraging because for me, there are times when I literally, I wonder if I'll ever really truly master anything related to functional medicine. But it's also inspiring because no matter how much I come to know, I always know there's so much more to learn. And I desperately want to know everything. And it ticks me off that I don't. And maybe you might share that with me, but I love the constant learning. And on for me in my own clinical experience, just when I think I have things figured out, I get a case that proves me wrong. And I feel like I'm starting all over again. And I've been in this game for a while. And, there are still sometimes so I'm just completely humbled by the types of cases and the complexity that I have to deal with. But the more that you understand the complexity of human function, the more humbling it should be. And again, for me, there was a time when I realized that all I had developed was a hodgepodge of knowledge bits. I had lots of details and strategies in my head about little things, but I didn't have a larger framework or a system to hang all those details on to help them make sense. So early on in my career, I felt I felt a lot like I was stumbling from consult to consult and trying this and trying that, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't. And then over time, probably even without knowing it, I started doing the same things with all of my cases because my experience had said, well, if I do this, it tends to work. But then I would get a case that this usual approach of doing XYZ didn't work for this case. And so I had to go back to the drawing board and rethink my strategies. And what I wanted for myself was some kind of a mental framework, call it a clinical framework that was flexible enough to handle the easiest and simplest of cases, but that would also work for the more complex cases. I wanted to see the interconnectedness of a complex symptom picture and be able to prioritize my clinical goals and targets because I realized you can't fix everything at once. And so you have to have a way to prioritize what you are going to do that makes sense again from a clinical standpoint. And it was kind of an aha moment for me when I realized that I actually had been using and even teaching a basic clinical model already. And Adair, mentioned some of the seminars that I've taught over the last 15, 16 years. And I've taught a 3-day mastering functional blood chemistry course many, many, many times, dozens of times since 2008. And what I realized is that while it was never explicitly stated in the seminar material, what we were really doing was teaching a set of clinical priorities that we could understand through blood work. And this is what it looked like. We talked about things like anemias and blood sugar issues, and we talked about them as being what we commonly call deal breakers, meaning that if you weren't good at finding and fixing them early on in a case, then good luck with everything else that was going on. And while all of these things are important, and certainly we could argue about things that are not on the list or which order to put them in, the bottom line is that there are some physiological systems and some functions that underlie everything else. Here's a classic example. Hormone balancing and control is predicated on let's call them 4 pillars, 4 key items. And finding and fixing these underlying mechanisms often allows hormones to sort themselves out, as it were, without the need to resort to hormone replacement strategies. Not that I'm against that, if that's what is necessary and what's in the best interest of the client. But a true functional medicine approach to hormones would start here first and would only move to replacement strategies if fixing these issues didn't translate into the clinical endpoints that you were looking for as a clinician who understands what the client is looking for. So here's what I want to share with you. I want to help you think about understanding functional medicine in its highest expression. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we talk about different clinical models that are out there. I also want to help you organize your thought process around complex clinical cases. And that means you have to have some sense of an effective clinical model. And of course, that's always a work in progress. Like every year, every 2 years, I update my own thought process because I've learned more things and I've gained more experience. But I also want you to be able to prioritize clinical targets. And to be honest, that's a big conversation. It's not something that we can button up in a 45-minute webinar. So we're going to stick to the big picture because here is the unvarnished truth. Human function is complex, and complex systems cannot be understood through an unsophisticated lens or an unsophisticated perspective. And while all of us do some form of, I'm using air quotes, I don't know if you can see me or not, but nutritional medicine by and large is stuck in, decades behind current science. And that's not to say that some things, say from the 1960s, don't work today, things that they were doing back then, they certainly do. But science and information and our understanding of these complex systems has progressed. And I think as clinicians, it's our duty to keep pace with that. One problem that we have in our industry is that the term functional medicine is ill defined, or maybe it's better to say that it's often misused, right? There's no real central authority that defines what functional medicine is, or a central authority that requires all of us to use the same term correctly. Like, meaning, like we all say functional medicine, we all actually mean the same thing. That's not the case. It's almost as if someone invokes the words, root cause, and that means that you do functional medicine regardless of what you actually do in practice. And then there are some people that completely downgrade functional medicine to simply prescribing supplements. And that's the entirety of their functional medicine strategy. And that's certainly a piece of it, but it's not the entirety of it. And one final comment here is that quite often the goals of, of your clinical and business models, they will often clash. You can either let your business model dictate your clinical model, or you can let your clinical model dictate your business model. And there isn't one right way to do it. That's up to you. But here's what I want you to consider. Your choice either places a higher demand on you as a clinician to have a more sophisticated clinical model, or it relieves you of that responsibility. Meaning that if you want to see a lot of people, you're only going to be successful with simpler cases. You're not going to be successful in managing more complicated cases, at least not on a routine basis. And the reason for that is because high patient volume means shorter and less frequent consults with each individual patient. And you can't understand complex problems and coach people through sticking points or negative reactions when you're limited by time and frequency of the interactions that you have with them. And so patient volume and patient engagement are inversely related with each other. And complex cases require higher engagement just by their very nature. Now, having said that, we need providers to handle simple cases. But over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a radical rise in the incidence of complex and chronic illness. We routinely deal with autoimmunity that's not regulated. We have neurodevelopment and neurodegenerative conditions. We have brain injuries. We have barrier dysfunctions, environmental sensitivities, chronic infections, and more. But the good news is that while human function is complex, it is understandable. But you have to be prepared for a lifelong learning process. You need to be okay with that. And you have to be willing to routinely update your clinical model as you gain knowledge and experience. Like I said, clinical models are always a work in progress because as you learn new things, it should change how you think about the work that you do. So, what is a model? And what types of models do we typically see in functional medicine? Well, a model is simply an informative representation of an object, a person, or a system. In this case, we're talking about systems. And if we look out over the functional medicine terrain, we can recognize some common clinical models that are employed. For example, we have a lot of practitioners that simply base their protocols on symptoms or maybe the results of some kind of a survey or a questionnaire. We have a lot of people saying they do functional medicine that base the protocols on conditions. Like if there's a diagnosis, like I'm infertile, I'm having trouble. Well, I've got a fertility protocol. That's a condition based approach. Very common is a nutrient deficiency model where someone might do a diet review and then basically count up all the nutrients to find what someone's deficient in. Or maybe they're a little bit more sophisticated and they run like a vibrance, or other companies do this, like an intracellular nutrient test, or maybe they run Vibrant Labs and they do some kind of a functional blood chemistry analysis, and then they prescribe supplements based on what the labs say they're deficient in or suggest that they're deficient in. Then there's the health always starts in the gut model or the detox first model. And my personal favorite, the one trick pony, which is where everything is caused by, and you can fill in the blank, whether that's everything's caused by mercury or everything's caused by parasites or everything's caused by mold. And everyone's got some kind of a chronic inflammatory respiratory syndrome or SIRS. And there's no doubt that each of these models can be successful in the right case. But each of these approaches is likely to fail as the complexity of somebody's metabolic derangement increases. The more complex the case, the more complex the model needs to be. And so the question remains that if we're seeing more and more complex and chronic health issues, which we all are, and if this complexity demands a more sophisticated clinical model, which it does, how do we start to build a clinical model that reflects the demands and the needs of the sick people that we're serving in our communities? That's the core question. And maybe we can translate that into how can you be the best clinician that you can be? And so, without a doubt, the most effective clinical model is based on systems and mechanisms and having some kind of a hierarchy of function. Now, why do I say that? Because we don't live in a world where someone comes in with one complaint coming from one place. Like, this is not the world we live in. In fact, I would love to live in this world where my clients have one mechanism causing one symptom in one system. That would make my job and your job so much more easy. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where people who need our expertise, who need your expertise, have multiple symptoms coming from multiple systems. And this is my crude attempt to map that out on a slide, right? The truth is that we all believe, at least I think we do, that each biological system is connected to all other biological systems. If not directly, then certainly indirectly. So we can never separate one system from another. And most of our clients in modern functional medicine practices have multiple mechanisms that are affecting these multiple interconnected systems and creating multiple symptomatology. And if your clinical model doesn't allow for this or doesn't match this, then you will only succeed in simple cases. And maybe that's where you like to live, and that's totally fine. These people need help too. There's just fewer of them out there. But if you're like me and you have that itch that needs to be scratched, like that incessant need to solve complex puzzles that nobody else can figure out, yeah, that's where I'm coming from. And so it's a fundamental tenet of natural medicine that we're not just a collection of independent parts that work in isolation. That's how conventional medicine work, and that's not what we do. And so in building an effective clinical model, I think the first step in adopting that and that mindset that lets you see things this way, is to introduce you to a researcher named Tomio Tada and to the concept of the supersystem. So back in 1997, Tomio Tada was describing the immune system specifically, but he later applied the concept of supersystem to the brain and hormonal systems, and other researchers have done the same thing since then. But just to give you some background, Tomio Tada was the guy who discovered T suppressor cells, right? And his work back in the 90s set the stage for all of the breakthroughs since the early 2000s in immune cell subsets like natural killer cells and Th1, Th2 systems, Th17 systems. His work set the background for identifying these different immune subsets and their functions that we use today in what we might call functional immunology. And so Dr. Tada's theory was that the immune system is a quote, self centered, autonomous system for monitoring the internal world, end quote. And in describing it, he used the word supersystem. So again, it's a self centered, autonomous system that monitors the internal world. And to maybe develop this concept of the super system a little bit more, a super system is a complex and integrative network of cells and molecules within the body that operate across various tissues and coordinates responses to threats in a self-regulating manner. Essentially, a super system is a system of systems with a high level of internal communication and adaptability. And I would argue that we have to start our thought process from this understanding. And if I was to take this concept of the super system and try to fit what I know, or at least what I think I know, into a graphical representation, into a model, then it might look something like this. I would start with the idea that the brain, the hormones, and the immune system work together to control and coordinate all aspects of human function. If you want to do some research on this, just look up the neuroendocrine-immune supersystem. You'll find all kinds of stuff. And while we do separate these things to learn them, or maybe to talk about them in a webinar, they are essentially different facets of the same thing. They are just different facets of the neuroendocrine-immune supersystem. I think you guys can see me, but if I show you the front and the back of my hand, you don't get confused thinking those are two different things. You just know that that's the front and the back of Steve's hand. And we need to think of the neuroendocrine-immune supersystem the same way. So you can't really have a sensible conversation about the hormones without talking about the impact of the brain and the immune system. And we can spin that around and look at that in these relationships, anything that we want. Yet while these three different facets of one larger thing are three different facets, but still one larger thing, it's very clear that the brain is in charge. And the brain has two-way communication pathways between hormones and immunity that allow it to monitor and respond to both internal and external environments. Right. In fact, the brain uses hormones and immune chemicals in conjunction with other receptor type systems and other communication systems to understand internal and external environments. And the word exteroception up there in the top left corner is the word that we use for how the brain understands the external world. And we understand that through receptors for sight and sound and smell and taste and touch and so on. But the word interoception refers to the brain's understanding of the internal world. Now, this is a relatively new concept in neurological literature or in immune literature as well. When I say relatively recent, I'm talking, say, within most of the research within the last 10 years. So it's not like 6 months ago. We've known about these things for a while, but now the research is gaining momentum and it's gaining traction. So we have these two-way communication systems, right? And interoception itself has multiple subcomponents. The brain always understands, and it might be misunderstanding, but it always understands what's happening with the immune system. It understands what's happening with the visceral or the organ system. It understands what's happening with hormones and other chemical constituents of the blood, like glucose or oxygen levels. And it also knows, like how your body is aligned in space and how you move around your environment. It also has an internal understanding of your own level of self-awareness, your attention and emotionality. And we might describe those with terms like cogniception or emotiception. And we know that these things are all linked together. We see this in practice all the time. We see people having emotional events when their blood sugar drops. We see someone who gets stressed out and their gut goes haywire. We see someone sustain a head injury who used to be healthy and now they're not. And all of a sudden they're hypogonadal, for example, or they have type 2 diabetes. And this stuff is clearly published in the literature. And then there's the entire field of psychoneuroimmunology, which looks at how our thoughts and emotions affect our immune system and vice versa. And with that, now we can start placing familiar things into the framework, like this. For example, the neuroendocrine system is where we see the subsystems of the adrenals, the thyroid, as well as the reproductive system. And each of those can be broken down further into their own systems and their own frameworks so that we can understand them clearly. For example, when I order a salivary adrenal profile from Vibrant, I know that what I'm looking at is more a reflection of the brain side of the HPA axis rather than the adrenal gland itself. And that's been the dominant thought in natural and functional medicine for decades, is that you look at a saliva profile and you're looking at the adrenal gland. You're not. You're looking at the brain. The brain is in control of how much cortisol you make, as well as the circadian rhythm. And the adrenal gland is really just a passive manufacturing facility. The intelligence that runs the system is in the brain. But if you don't know how this in its own right is a super system, but how this subsystem of the neuroendocrine system, if you don't know where that fits and how it works, then again, you might run a Vibrant saliva profile and think you're looking at adrenal gland function. Again, you're not. You're looking at the end product of how the brain is perceiving stress and using the adrenal glands to respond by either increasing or decreasing cortisol production at different times of the day. Now, over on the right-hand side, it's almost a shocking revelation to learn that your brain monitors your immune system. And it not only does that, it actually helps control balance between, say, your Th1, Th2 systems. Beyond that, it encodes memories of immune related events that can be called up later. And this is part of the pathophysiology of things like PTSD, where a memory of something that happened in the past that's bad can completely overthrow someone's entire physiological environment. It's because when that memory gets called up, it calls up the coding for an inflammatory state. And so you can have an emotional event in your brain and experience inflammation throughout your entire body, for example. Hey, obviously, it's more complicated than that. And what might even be a little bit more freaky to think about is that you have immune memory that gets stored in your peripheral tissues that have been inflamed or damaged. Let's say that you injure your ankle, sprain your ankle, for example. Your peripheral tissues and your brain remember that event. And if we could magically 10 years later go back and stimulate the part of the brain that holds the memory of the ankle injury, the ankle will become inflamed. And this is not Steve just making stuff up. This stuff is published in the neurological and immunological literature. So the entire purpose of this massive interconnectedness and interdependence is so that we can think and we can move and we can feel, so that we can explore our environment safely and engage with other people to do things that make life worthwhile. And in short, I would argue that quality of life and functional capacity are determined in large part by how well this entire system plays nice with itself, at least when it comes to health and wellness and functional capacity. And I would also argue that anytime someone comes into your office or consults with you over Zoom, for example, and they complain of multiple symptoms in multiple systems, and they're a more complex case, you're always dealing with some kind of a disconnection or functional breakdown between brain hormones and immune system. And that's just your job to find where the system is breaking down. Now, your brain uses things like your physical body and your organ systems as effectors. Remember, it's constantly monitoring the internal, external environments, making decisions, then issuing command. In fact, when we teach our basic courses on brain chemistry, even the Mastering Brain Chemistry course, we start with this idea that the brain is simply an input output organism. So it takes in all this information from the external world, all this information from the internal environment, makes decisions, then issue commands to the effector systems. And that would roughly be divided between the visceral system and the musculoskeletal system. But this is also where the brain gut axis lives, right? That vaunted connection between the brain to the gut through the vagal system. And the brain gut axis is a super system in and of itself because it is, while it's not entirely brain, it's got a lot of neurological tissue. Let me walk you through this. the brain gut axis it's a network system, almost like a network function. The gut enteric nervous system, which we commonly call the second brain, has more neurological tissue than the entire spinal cord. 70% of your immune system is in the gut mucosal tissue. And we know that the gut makes hormones and cytokines and other peptides that circulate through the blood, get to the brain, and affect brain behavior. So the brain gut axis is basically a conglomeration of all of those things. And the sanctity of all of these systems as they work together is protected and safeguarded by our primary barrier systems, right? The barriers safeguard us from the external environment, things that want to trigger us, they want to poison us, infect us, or inflame us. And the barrier system, and I'm ignoring the skin just for the point of this conversation, but they do it in a three-tiered way, right? The gut and the lung barriers down in the bottom right-hand corner, they protect our vascular space from the outside, while the vascular endothelial barrier and the blood-brain barrier, which is really just the capillary system that dives into the brain tissue, those two barriers protect the vascular endothelial cells itself and the submucosal or the subendothelial system, as well as the brain environment, respectively, from things that are able to enter into circulation that perhaps should have been excluded, or things that are generated from within that could be a problem. For example, you may have someone who has a poorly controlled autoimmunity, they're chronically and systemically inflamed. Those cytokines, that inflammatory state will affect the brain because these cytokines can travel across the blood brain barrier and affect how the brain behaves, even if the blood brain barrier is intact. But the barrier system there is, as I said before, these are like your brain is a sacred environment. The tissue that makes up your blood vessels is a sacred environment and they have to be protected. And then the final piece of the puzzle, again, at least as I see it, is the one thing that underlies all functions and all systems, and that is energy metabolism. It's the ability to make ATP. And maybe at this point it doesn't surprise you that since these are all systems of systems, each system is a subsystem of a larger system, and they all can be broken down within their own mental framework to be able to organize your thought process about it. And so what I want to do is go from this really large picture overview of how all these systems work, how they work together, and just dive all the way down to the cell and share with you the mental framework that I use when I'm working up cases. Whether fatigue is part of the picture or not is it's almost irrelevant. It's not irrelevant in all cases, but all systems. Well, let me just show you what I'm talking about. When you're presented with these complex scenarios, again, that we're all dealing with these days, we have to start with the idea of the neuroendocrine-immune supersystem. We also have to hold another thought in our mind, which is that every system is made up of organs and glands, and organs and glands are made up of different tissue types, and each different tissue type is made up of different cell types. And we have to factor in the fact that all of these cells have to make ATP to get the energy to function, to do their jobs. And if we hold that thought in our mind, then it stands to reason that anything that interferes with energy production will dysregulate function at all levels, or at least has the potential to do that. And so, again, being adept at finding and fixing cell metabolism problems is critically important for your clinical success. But I'm not talking about like just simply giving someone mitochondrial support. Like we've been talking about mitochondria in functional medicine for so long. And the conversation almost always boils down to, Krebs cycle intermediates and, nutraceutical companies make various forms of mitochondrial supplements, and we might have single ingredient formulas that are designed to protect mitochondrial cell membranes and DNA from oxidative stress. And all that stuff is good. That is not the end of the story of the mitochondria. And maybe you run like an organic acids test to see if there's any blockages in the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, and those can certainly be helpful, but not in the absence of a view of the larger picture. And so if we look at energy metabolism, it's not just about throwing mitochondrial support at somebody. It's not even just simply about, do you have prediabetes or you reactive hypoglycemic? It's a much more complex picture than that. So let me bring you through again how I see this and how I work up these complex cases myself. We start with the framework. The larger framework breaks down into different categories of provision, perfusion, production, and then protection. And when it comes to provision, as it relates to energy metabolism, this is all about substrate supply. And it's also about substrate accessibility. And what I mean by that is obviously we get the substrate for energy production largely from our diet. And so your entire process of reviewing someone's diet, making sure they're consuming enough calories or roughly the right amount of calories, and how you spread those calories between protein, fat, and carbohydrates, those decisions matter. Because I will tell you, I have yet to meet I've yet to meet a client with a complex health issue who was following a good diet other than maybe like, from a content perspective, like I'm doing AIP or I'm on a SIBO diet or something like that. But content is again only one component of a good dietary prescription. You also have quantity and you have chronometry. Can someone or should someone use intermittent fasting strategies, for example? How long can they go without food before something goes wrong? So that's roughly the idea of substrate supply. And then we have substrate accessibility. This is, very commonly a problem with people who want to lose body fat and they can't. Like, I don't get it, doc. I eat like hardly anything and I exercise 6 days a week and I still can't lose any weight. Well, sometimes it's because the ability to break down body fat, the lipolytic system or lipolytic pathway is being inhibited. Maybe it's because they're inflamed. Maybe it's because their insulin is too high, any number of reasons. Or maybe it's an environmental chemical problem where we have chemical obesogens that have tricked the fat cells either into multiplying or enlarging. And the reason why we can't lose weight is not because you don't have the fuel there, it's just you can't get to it. And we could make similar arguments for the processes of gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis. Like the energy's there. Can you get to it? So that's number one is provision. Number two is about perfusion. This is about getting things that are in the blood to the places where they need to go. And, this is where we would commonly talk about things like, actually, let me back up because I realized I didn't mention anything about red blood cells and this three gas system. And, and then this kind of gets into both provision as well as perfusion, because in order for us to be able to make energy, the most abundant or efficient way we do that is through oxidative phosphorylation, or what we call aerobic metabolism, right? Burning some kind of a fuel source in the presence of oxygen. And that's all about the mitochondria, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain. Well, if you're anemic and you've got low red blood cell count, low hematocrit or hemoglobin, or if you're deficient in nitric oxide and you can't drop off oxygen that is present in the system, then you're not going to be able to make large amounts of energy and you're going to be relegated to anaerobic metabolism, which by itself has some issues. So that's the final piece of the provision. And again, obviously, this is a much larger conversation. Remember, we're trying to stay really big picture. So now the second priority in terms of energy metabolism is, can we get the stuff we need for energy production to the places where it needs to go? And the main things here are things like blood pressure, blood flow, and capillarization. And the reason why I point that out is because one of the very common things we see with chronically ill people is hypotension. Their blood pressure is simply too low, and they don't have the perfusion to be able to push the nutrients in the blood that may be available into the tiny spaces in the cells where we would actually make energy. And so hypotension it's not commonly talked about. Everyone, of course, in the medical community is focused on high blood pressure, as well they should be. But something that gets missed in natural medicine is this chronic hypotension. And you'll hear people come in and go like, I don't know why I've been sick for 20 years. And then you look at their blood pressure and it's like 90 over 62. And they're like, oh yeah, my doctor says I'll never have a heart attack. Like, well, I think I know why you're chronically fatigued and you're just not getting better is because you can't deliver nutrients to the tissues that need them. So blood pressure is very important. And then capillarization is important too, because one of the hallmarks of these chronic illness is a sedentary lifestyle and perhaps low exercise tolerance. And what ends up happening, and again, I'm not making this up, this is all in the literature, mostly in exercise science. But if you're active and then you stop after a certain point of time, you lose the capillaries, the very tiny blood vessels that feed your tissues. Obviously, they don't go to zero, but you reduce your potential to increase blood flow to end target organs simply because your body's like, well, I guess we don't need those anymore. And so part of a recovery strategy, if you will, for someone who's chronically ill and sedentary is they must exercise. But then we run into the conundrum is that a lot of these people have very low exercise tolerance. And so they can't do much or else they fall apart. This is part of the clinical challenge. Like, how do we get people exercising when they're chronically inflamed and they're fatigued and, they're susceptible to flaring up just with the slightest physical activity? Not that we can't solve that problem, but you have to be strategic and you have to have a mental framework. You have to have a model. And then the last two, the next one would be production. That's energy production itself. And this would be an opportunity to talk about different fuel types and energy systems. We just mentioned aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. And of course, very quickly, anaerobic systems, your glycolytic pathway, the only fuel source that can be used there is glucose. But aerobic metabolism can burn anything, anything that's burnable, right? You can burn glucose through aerobic systems, the mitochondria, or you can burn free fatty acids, you can burn ketones, and to a small extent, you can convert amino acids into a fuel source that you can use as well. But one of the key things here is to think about somebody's metabolic flexibility, which unfortunately too many times gets pigeonholed as simply can you burn body fat, when in fact the concept of metabolic flexibility is that you burn the right fuel in the right circumstance. So if I need to sprint up the stairs or sprint because, to the sidewalk because a car is going to mow me down, I want to be able to tap into my high energy, high intense, very short duration systems, which are all either, glucose based or other things like intracellular ATP or phosphocreatine. But that's totally different than the system that allows me to just have energy through the day when I'm doing chores around the house, or I'm sitting in an office, or I'm just walking casually down the street. Those are more mitochondrial type, aerobic type things. Then again, you can burn not just fats in the mitochondria, but glucose as well. In fact, I would share with you that um, very rarely, like very rarely, are you ever burning only one type of fuel. And you'll never get to a point where you're only burning fat as a fuel source. You're always burning a mixture of fat as well as carbohydrates or glucose. And one of the key things to help to understand whether or not someone has metabolic flexibility or if they've lost that, I just realized that I haven't put these up here. So let me do that. I'll just finish them all off. But one of the key things to look for in terms of like your clinical intake process is when someone presents with a reactive hypoglycemic picture, meaning, they skip meals or if they don't eat enough food or don't eat frequently enough, they get hangry, they get shaky, irritable, lightheaded, they get some kind of an emotional concomitant. These people are telling you they've lost metabolic flexibility because when you are metabolically flexible, you can not eat for days and be perfectly fine. And in fact, I routinely ask clients when I do my intake, in fact, that's part of my intake paperwork, how long can you go without eating before something goes wrong? And depending on their answer, it's going to lead me down one thought process versus another one. And then finally, the last element of energy metabolism is protection. And when we look at cell function and the production of ATP, it's never just about whether or not you can make energy. It's also about whether or not you can control waste management. And in particular, when we look at aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, we need some way to control the acidity and the metabolic waste that comes as a result of making ATP. And that would come in the form mostly of hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide. And the hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide are made both as in aerobic and anaerobic systems. But if we can't buffer these systems, let's say we're able to, like we have substrate supply, we have provision, we can perfuse our tissues and we get nutrients where they need to go. We have good oxygenation. We can actually make energy through both glycolytic as well as um, anaerobic or anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. If we can't buffer the hydrogen ions and CO2 that comes as a result of making ATP, the change in the tissue acidity will shut down the enzymes that make energy, and we end up in a fatigue, not because you can't make energy, but you can't control the waste management. And for me, this was like, it seemed to be the final piece of a complex puzzle. It's like, why can't I help this person with their fatigue? And when I started to learn and understand about this concept of waste management, it added one more thing that I could factor into my thought process, into my model. And then, of course, we also have aspects of oxidative stress. And this is, kind of the stuff that's usually talked about with mitochondrial health and fatigue management is like, oh, as you make energy, you make this oxidative stress, these reactive oxygen species, and that turns around and damages mitochondrial membrane and mitochondrial DNA. And that's why you're tired, is because you don't have enough antioxidants. So here's your glutathione, or here's your antioxidant spectrum. And a lot of times it just doesn't work. And maybe they're working in the right realm of protection, but maybe they're just simply pulling on the wrong string. Maybe it's a waste management problem and not a mismatch between the oxidative stress and the antioxidant capacity. And the final aspect there is the ability to protect our systems and our cells from accumulated junk. And this is where concepts like autophagy and mitophagy come in, where the intelligence of the cells and the capacity is there to recycle and reuse um, used pieces and parts so that they don't gum up the works. And I just got my, I could keep talking forever. In fact, I have a whole bunch of other slides, but if you've listened to this, and if you're, signed in initially, apparently you're going to get a copy of the slides as well as a link to watch this again. But, I'll just show you this quickly because I created these slides just to kind of show you a little bit more about each of these clinical and biochemical priorities, whether it is perfusion and tissue oxygenation, or maybe it has to do with glycemic control and metabolic flexibility, or it has to do with things like circadian rhythm and stress chemistry, or immune tolerance and immune competence, whether it has to do with the brain gut axis, or whether it has to do with very common clinical problems like thyroid, but in particular Hashimoto's disease. And in your slide set, I'll also share with you a very effective way to understand the thyroid system and to look at and to divide thyroid function into three different types of errors, whether they are production errors, processing errors, or what are called proteomic errors. And I wish I had another hour to go through all of this stuff with you guys. But I think we'll leave it there at that. Like I said, I'll try to keep it to 45 minutes. I'm just a few minutes over. Adair, are you still there?
Absolutely. Here I am. Thank you for that phenomenal framework for managing complex cases.
My
Now,
pleasure.
bring us back in the slide here so you can see us. All right. So now's the time for questions, everyone. I saw one question that came in during your presentation, Dr. Noseworthy. So let me put that on the screen. So Anne-Marie wants to know, can you explain how the salivary profile is a reflection of brain or pituitary function versus the adrenal function itself versus urinary?
Yeah, so there's actually a couple of things, I think, in that question. One is the difference between saliva testing and urinary metabolites. And anytime you measure a metabolite, it's always post-hepatic and post-renal. So you're just assuming that your liver and your kidneys are handling the parent compound properly when you're assessing something in urine. So that's one thing. But as it relates to the saliva profile being a reflection of the brain, the quantity, like when I teach this, in fact, I'm in a week, I'm traveling to California to teach our Mastering Brain course with Apex Energetics. And we'll talk about this there because, so for my book, like if I could encourage new clinicians or people trying to learn this stuff, in terms of like what's a good diagnostic workup for most cases. I would say look at Vibrant's blood chemistry panel, look at their salivary adrenal index, and look at their gut zoomer. Right. I think if you survey fundamental human metabolism with good comprehensive blood work, you look at their circadian rhythm and their cortisol sufficiency, and you get a hold of the gut and whether or not they've got inflammation, infections, microbiome balance, or permeability, you're going to get a lot of information that's relevant and usable. I tend to think of those three things as I call them tier one tests. Tier two would be things that I don't do on everyone, but I do commonly because it's relevant to each case. And then tier three is I hardly ever do these, but once in a while I might. So tier one would be those. So the saliva testing, the reason why I say that it's part of the brain, or it is a reflection of the brain, is because the amount of cortisol that you make is a reflection of the activity of what's called the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. And I realized I just kind of flew through the information for the whole thing. So I don't want to overwhelm people with either speed or terminology. But in neurospeak, we would say that whether you're making more or less cortisol is a reflection of the central integrative state of the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus that serves the HPA axis. So, it's called the HPA axis. The A is the last one. The whole system starts in the brain. It starts with the hypothalamus, which is constantly monitoring cortisol levels and asking itself, do I have enough to handle all my stressors? And if the answer is no, it will turn on and it will send a stronger signal to the adrenals to make more cortisol. And then that cortisol change will feed back into the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus say, did you do your job? And if it's satisfied, it will tune down. So it's constantly monitoring stress and tuning up or tuning down cortisol production. So clearly, cortisol quantity is a reflection of the activity of that part of the brain. The circadian rhythm is predominantly controlled by another part of the brain called the hippocampus. And it lives in the medial wall of the temporal lobe. And it basically puts the brake on excessive cortisol production because it's part of your survival system. So your primal brain, your survival system wants to make cortisol all the time because basically your primal systems feel like they're always being attacked, right? So without the higher cortical development, everything would go crazy. And so the hippocampus controls the circadian rhythm. And I'll throw one more wrinkle in there. There's a higher structure called the insular cortex that coordinates all of this. So very clearly, saliva and salivary profiles are telling us actually more about brain, different parts of the brain, and the brain's perception of stress adequacy. And if those brain parts aren't working well, if it misunderstands the stress level, or obviously if there's a defect in the production process within the gland, whether it's an Addison's disease or whatever, that's going to throw a monkey wrench in there. But I'm telling you that if you look at the literature and how the systems are designed, salivary cortisol quantity and circadian rhythm is controlled by the brain.
Phenomenal answer. Very comprehensive. Next question from Angela Pfeiffer. What is your process for uncovering why a person has low blood pressure and hypofusion? It's my understanding that neuroinflammation is a likely culprit.
Yeah. So, just like the adrenals are under the control of the brain, so is blood pressure. But one of the big factors in low blood pressure and hypoperfusion is weak cardiac output and, just kind of dispensing with heart diseases. That could be someone's deconditioned. Their heart's just not strong enough. But quite often it's like functional dehydration, right? Because when you look at the vascular space, it's a closed tubular system. And if you reduce the fluid volume in that system, pressure goes down. It's just simple fluid dynamics. And so quite often the easiest strategy is to have people drink salty water, right? Increase their water intake, but have them either use electrolytes with plenty of sodium in them, or I'll just have people get like Celtic sea salt or pink Himalayan salt and put as much salt in that as they can handle and make sure they increase their fluid intake and increase their sodium intake to increase their fluid retention. And as that happens, blood pressure tends to go up. I've had one case recently where that strategy hasn't worked, but it's worked in many, many, many cases. There might be some hypoadrenia associated with low aldosterone, could be part of that as well. And so sometimes supporting the adrenals, which again, you can run a salivary panel through Vibrant and figure that out pretty quickly.
Great. Thank you. Next question is from Linda. She asked, can you discuss the ileocecal valve problem for a patient with a history of Crohn's that had that surgically removed and impact on brain?
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to know more about that case, and I know that we didn't talk about this kind of stuff, but one, I will tell you that when you look at the brain gut axis, the vagal system, and it's really more complicated than that, but the vagal system or the brain side of the brain gut axis is responsible for four primary things in the gut. It's responsible for driving gut motility, increasing the production of things like hydrochloric acid, enzymes, and bile. It's responsible for blood flow to the gut, and it's responsible for controlling all the sphincters. So the esophageal sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, as well as the ileocecal valve. So one of the times, or one of the things that we see very commonly in clinical practice is brain gut axis in the form of SIBO, right? Where the ileocecal valve fails to close, and we can't compartmentalize lower and upper GI systems. And so the bacteria in the colon and the large intestine migrate back up into the small intestine, and it feeds on fermentable compounds that are high up or that are coming from the diet. Now, I know that that doesn't really have anything to do with Crohn's, but I'm assuming from the question that the ileocecal valve, like they must have had some kind of a bowel resection, and the ileocecal valve is removed. It's, obviously this isn't a conversation, but it seems to me that um, when you remove large portions of the GI system, you're taking away some of the sensory or the afferent information that would then travel back up to the vagus into the brain itself, right? Because that's a bidirectional information highway. And it just so happens that I forget the number, so don't quote me on this, but let's say roughly 75% of the information that travels through the vagus goes from the gut to the brain and not the other way around, right? So anything you do to remove that input into the brain can change the brain's perception of that organ system. And here's an example that most of us probably will understand. If you've ever turned an ankle, like sprained a ligament in your ankle, unless you're really good with your rehab, you're probably going to sprain that ankle again. And so people tend to repeatedly sprain the same ankle over and over and over again. They go, well, I just have weak ankles. Well, that's not what the reason is, because when you disrupt tissue, like tear connective tissue, it changes the brain's perception of that joint and its orientation in space, right? Because we have a picture, we have a motor and a sensory homunculus up in our brain, which is basically a picture of our entire body. So that if I reach out and touch you on your shoulder, I touch your shoulder and not your ankle. And so when you tear the structures of the ankle, it changes the brain's perception of that. And unless you rehabilitate that connection, the brain doesn't know where the ankle is and what it's doing in relationship to the knee and the hip. So it's very easy to turn it over because the brain doesn't know how to control it. Now take that and apply it to the gut. So if you have a bowel resection, or if you have chronic gut inflammatory issues and you're changing the sensory input in the brain's perception of the gut changes, and its ability to control the gut changes, because it needs to have an accurate perception of the gut to control the gut. And that's the whole concept of interoception, or specifically visceroception. And that's mediated through the vagal system, but it's all integrated in what's called the insular cortex.
Great answer. Thank you.
Maybe more detail than you wanted. That's
Um, we are at the top of the hour, but there are still a few more questions you have time to go over, Dr.
sure.
Nesworth.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Um, some great kudos to you. Fascinating webinar. Do you offer consultations for functional practitioners that are stuck with helping clients with complex cases?
I absolutely do it all the time. Yeah. So they can just, they can email me at drn@drnoseworthy.com, and maybe you can provide that to everyone.
Sure.
Or there's a contact form on my website, which is just simply drnoseworthy.com. So, look somewhere up on the bar. It's been a long time since I've looked at my own website. But there's a contact form there. You can just identify yourself as a practitioner who wants to do a case consult. I'd be happy
All right. Thank you for that. Next one, any tips on neuropathies? What should be
to.
prioritized first metabolically?
Well, if I had a single answer for that, I'd be a very wealthy person. Yeah. So, um, to be honest, my tip is don't get locked into kind of stock treatment approaches because it could be one thing in one case and something in something else. And I'll just relate a very quick story. This was many years ago. I had a lady. I was practicing in Florida at the time, and I had a lady come see me from Alberta, Canada, and she had been like she was a little bit older. She came in, she was wearing Birkenstocks, and she said that her only goal was she wanted to wear closed-toed shoes, but she couldn't because of her neuropathy. Her feet were swollen, they were red, and they were painful, and she said, "I'm so embarrassed when I go out in public for people to see my feet. I just want to be able to wear closed-toed shoes." Well, long story short, it turned out that she had a gluten sensitivity, that included a reaction to something called transglutaminase 6. And transglutaminase 6 is a protein that's appears in neurological tissue, both central and peripheral. And so we put her on a gluten-free diet, and literally within 3 weeks, she's 80% better. I mean, this was crazy. Now, we all have these kind of miracle type stories, and you can't build your clinical approach on one miracle story. But my point is, and this is really the point of the whole webinar, is while it might be expeditious to promote yourself as an expert in one thing or another. Like I'm an expert in thyroid, I'm an expert in detox, I'm an expert in neuropathies. To be the best clinician you can be, you have to be the ultimate generalist, right? You have to like once somebody is in your in a consultation with you, you have to wipe the slate clean, look through this complex lens that I was talking about, this integrated model of super systems so that you don't lock yourself into a thought process that's going to lead you down the wrong clinical path. And so I wish I could tell you, well, here's the tip for neuropathies. The tip is find like work them up and fix what you find. That would be my tip. And that would be my tip for every case. Work them up and fix what you find.
Yeah, test, don't guess.
Exactly.
Another one from Amber. Any tips, resources on how to learn all we went over in more detail mastery level?
Um, well, if you want to reach out to me and give me your contact, I have some things coming next year that might be of interest. Now, having said that, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say, all of the Apex Energetics courses are top notch. And in fact, I think that, and I'm not saying this because I created the material, but um, I do think that Apex is one of the best functional medicine educational systems out there. I call it the Apex ecosystem. So I would suggest that you also might want to check out the Karazian Institute. But like I said, reach out to me. I'll be creating a list for follow up for some things that I've got in the works.
Thank you. So going back to that last slide with the 3 ways to look at the thyroid issues, have you done podcasts on this topic that can be accessed for more information?
Yeah, so you probably find that on the Inflammation Nation podcast, not the Funk About Nation. So the Inflammation Nation is the one about the one for the lay public. Like I said, I just talk a lot of functional medicine on it, and it's some of my earlier podcasts. So you'll just have to either search for, thyroid or scroll to the earliest episodes. This is something, this, even though I do teach this in the Mastering Thyroid course, and every time thyroid comes up in any Apex seminar, but this is my, like, that's not an Apex thing. I don't know anybody else in the Apex world that teaches this, but it's the way the system's designed. And that's my thing. It's like, how's the system designed? Can I understand how it's designed? And can I order my thought process around that?
Yeah, once you have that framework, it's easy for understanding what's going wrong
Exactly.
because you can see where the kink is in the system.
Exactly. Is it this or is it that?
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So here we go. When discussing electrolytes, they are adding more water and more salt, but what is the root cause?
Yeah. So again, in my estimation, the most common thing is a combination of like a functional dehydration coupled with reactive hypoglycemia and some kind of adrenal dysfunction, usually low cortisol aldosterone. We don't measure aldosterone, right? So we just kind of go, well, if you show up with a certain clinical presentation and your cortisol happens to be low, we're just going to clinically assume. And I think it's a good educated guess. It is a guess, but I think it's an educated one. But you'll see that constellation, dare I call it like actually let me back up one step further. And I had like the I think one of the slides that we didn't go through that I went through quickly at the end, the one about blood sugar control and glycemic control, talks about the nightmare patient, right? And not the nightmare patient in the sense that they're just a pain in the tuchus. It's just like the nightmare clinically, like very hard to help. And that would be someone who has like they're anemic, they're a reactive hypoglycemic, they're hypotensive, and they lack metabolic flexibility. That's a very difficult that's a difficult case to solve unless you can get them to focus on those things. Now, you as a clinician have to be focused on those things because each of those represents a deal breaker, right? The anemia, the dysglycemia, the hypotension, it all boils down to I can't make and I can't buffer waste management at the cell level. And nothing's going to work until you fix those things.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right. One last question. What's the go to source for literature?
Yeah, I mean, I use PubMed. Yeah. So if I'm interested in anything, like, and obviously not all journals are created equal, right? So some journals are more, let's say, trustworthy than others, but then you have to factor in all the recent revelations about corruption in the whole world of publishing research, which is it's probably a webinar that somebody else should run. Um, but yeah, I just if I have interest in understanding physiology, I just study. I just go to read like physiology review articles. Might dust off some old textbooks, get new textbooks. I do an awful lot of study of basic physiology, and I routinely encourage docs that I coach personally or docs that attend seminars that I teach, especially the blood chemistry stuff, like don't skip steps. Like there is this tendency for all of us, myself included, to be distracted by the shiny new stuff, right? There's new labs, new technologies, new therapies, and you get bought into doing these things. And then all of a sudden you realize, well, forgot about how important it is to help someone with their blood sugar or to find anemias and fix those. And
Mhm.
so I am a big fan of being a master of the basics. And that's boring as all get out, but it's what works. It's what works.
It's a great way to end. I don't see any more questions. Oh, scroll down, saw more. Um, Goodness. Okay. Hide this one. Let's show this one. Yes, a bowel was resected due to Crohn's at ileum to colon.
Feel I'm Nicole.
And then following up on that, ileocecal valve. I'm a SIBO specialist, and chronic stress inhibits the vagus nerve, which causes the ileocecal valve dysregulation for IBS post-infectious. Can reduce vinculin and induce the interstitial cells of Cajal dysregulation. 80% of vagus nerve function is receiving information from the gut to brain. 5% is motor, and the remaining is signal to the brain to gut, supporting digestion, blood flow, motility, etc. A question or just a
Yeah, it's just a statement. It's feedback.
okay? All right. Any response to that?
Yeah, I don't disagree really with anything, but I would encourage people, and in fact, the last couple of episodes that I've aired on the Funk Med Nation podcast with doctors Melillo and Skyer, these are the guys who are literally world experts in treating autism. Um, we have part three of that conversation coming up in a couple of, well, actually, we're going to record it early December. So it won't be until right before Christmas that it comes out. But we're going to spend probably 2 hours talking about interoception and the insular cortex. And so, in functional medicine for the past 5 years or so, the vagus nerve and vagal stimulation has been a big thing. But if you worked with people with SIBO long enough doing vagal stimulation, you realize it doesn't work for everybody. And and I think the reason for that, there could be different reasons. One of the reasons for that is because basically the vagus is the gateway to the insular cortex. And I think that when we do vagal stimulation techniques, we're actually harnessing it to change the insular cortex. And there might be other ways to improve insular cortex function, which then would translate into better visceroception and better visceromotor control. And again, that's a whole other conversation, but I would encourage you to listen to the interviews. I have two posted already with doctors Skyer and Malillo, and the primary focus is autism, attention deficit, OCD. There's a lot of geeky neuro speak there. And so if brain is not your background, then you might want to go to the Inflammation Nation and look for recent episodes. I put up two episodes called The Better Brain Equation, which is basically a discussion about how the brain develops and how it works to give people a grounding to understand the more complicated conversations with Dr. Skyer and Malillo. So Inflammation Nation podcast, the Better Brain Equation, and then the interviews would be the best way to do that.
Thank you. You're clearly a wealth of knowledge. Thank you for this presentation today. Thanks for staying after 13 minutes to answer all of the questions that came
Oh,
up.
it's been my pleasure.
Audience, thank you all so much for attending. Again, you will get the recording and the slides. And until next time, stay vibrant, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, guys.